The postcard arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, slipped between utility bills and grocery store flyers. Elena Martinez pulled it from the mailbox of their Brooklyn brownstone apartment, immediately recognizing the elegant script before she even read the words. The image on the front showed the Eiffel Tower at dusk, its iron latticework glowing amber against a deepening violet sky. She turned it over. The message was brief but unmistakable in its warmth. "My dear Elena and Thomas, I've booked a week in Paris for November. 2 rooms at a hotel near the Marais. Consider it an early anniversary gift. Your father misses you both terribly. Please say yes. All my love, Bernard." Elena stood in the narrow hallway of their building, holding the postcard as autumn light filtered through the frosted glass of the entry door. She read the message twice, trying to locate the feeling stirring beneath her immediate reaction. Thomas would be thrilled. His father rarely extended invitations like this, and Paris had been a place they had talked about visiting together for years, always deferring the plan because of work schedules, finances, or simply the inertia of daily life. But now here it was, offered freely, generously even. She climbed the 3 flights to their apartment and found Thomas hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table, reviewing architectural blueprints for a residential project in Queens. He worked as a mid-level designer at a firm specializing in affordable housing, a position that demanded long hours for modest pay. The work fulfilled him in ways that mattered, but it also consumed him. Evenings often bled into nights, weekends into preparation for Monday presentations. Elena, who managed operations for a small non-profit focused on immigrant services, understood the demands of meaningful but exhausting work. Their marriage, now entering its 4th year, had settled into a rhythm defined more by parallel schedules than shared experiences. "Your father sent this," she said. Placing the postcard on the table beside his coffee mug, Thomas picked it up, his expression shifting from concentration to surprise, then to something close to delight. "Paris," he said, as if testing the word. "He's serious about this?" "Seems like it. 2 rooms. A week in November." Thomas leaned back in his chair, still holding the postcard. "We haven't seen him since last Christmas. He kept saying he wanted to do something special. But I didn't think he meant this." Bernard Martinez was 62. A retired literature professor who had spent most of his career teaching French modernism at a small liberal arts college in Vermont. After Thomas's mother passed away from ovarian cancer 6 years earlier, Bernard had withdrawn into a quieter existence, filling his days with reading, gardening, and occasional visits to his son in New York. He was a thoughtful man, soft-spoken, with a preference for solitude that had deepened with grief. Thomas admired his father, but also worried about his isolation. The invitation to Paris felt like a gesture toward reconnection, a way of pulling himself back into the world. "Should we go?" Elena asked, though she could already see the answer forming in Thomas's face. "I think we should," he said. "It's been too long since we took a real trip, and he's paying for the hotel. We just need flights and meals." Elena nodded slowly. There was no practical reason to decline. Her organization could spare her for a week, especially if she planned around their annual fundraising cycle. Thomas could negotiate the time off, though it would require advance notice and careful scheduling. What gave her pause was harder to name. Perhaps it was the intimacy implied by the arrangement, a week spent not just with Thomas, but with his father as well. She had always gotten along with Bernard. He was kind, attentive in his reserved way, and he treated her with a respect that felt genuine. But she had never spent extended time alone with him, and the prospect of sharing daily meals, museum visits, and evening walks felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. Still, she smiled and said, "Let's do it." Thomas reached for his phone immediately, drafting a response to his father. Within the hour, Bernard had replied with flight details and hotel information. The plan solidified quickly. They would leave on November 10th and return on the 17th. Bernard would arrive a day earlier to handle check-in and ensure everything was arranged. The hotel he had chosen was a boutique property tucked into a narrow street near Place des Vosges, a historic square in the Marais district, known for its arcaded buildings and quiet elegance. The neighborhood appealed to Bernard's sensibilities. Literary cafes and second-hand bookshops within walking distance. The kind of Paris he had studied and idealized throughout his academic career. In the weeks leading up to the trip, Elena found herself preoccupied with small preparations. She purchased a new coat, researched restaurants, and downloaded walking tour apps on her phone. Thomas, meanwhile, threw himself into finishing his current project ahead of schedule, working late into the evenings to clear his responsibilities before the trip. Their conversations about Paris were practical, logistical, focused on itineraries and packing lists. Neither of them addressed the subtle tension that had been present in their marriage for months. The growing sense that they were living side by side rather than together. Elena had felt it most acutely in moments of silence. When Thomas came home exhausted and retreated into his laptop, when entire weekends passed without meaningful conversation, when intimacy became a scheduled obligation rather than a spontaneous expression of closeness. She did not blame him. She recognized her own role in the drift, her tendency to withdraw into work, to prioritize tasks over connection. But recognizing a problem and addressing it were different things, and neither of them seemed willing or able to name what was slipping away. On the evening of November 9th, they finished packing in their bedroom, laying out clothes and toiletries with methodical efficiency. Thomas zipped his suitcase and set it by the door. "I think my dad's really looking forward to this," he said. He sounded different on the phone last week. "Lighter, maybe." Elena folded a sweater into her bag. "It'll be good for him. And for us." Thomas looked at her, and for a moment she thought he might say something more, something about the distance between them. But instead he just nodded and carried his suitcase into the hallway. The moment passed, as so many moments had passed, unmarked and unresolved. They left for JFK early the next morning, navigating subway transfers and security lines with practiced efficiency. The flight to Paris departed on time, a 7-hour journey that Eleanor spent reading a novel she had been meaning to finish for months. Thomas worked on his tablet, reviewing project notes and responding to emails. By the time they landed at Charles de Gaulle, it was early evening Paris time. The sky already dark. Bernard met them in the hotel lobby, dressed in a wool sweater and khakis, looking healthier than Elena remembered. His hair had gone fully grey since she last saw him, but his face carried a warmth that had been absent at Christmas. He embraced Thomas first, then turned to Elena, kissing her on both cheeks in the French manner he had always favoured. "You both made it," he said, his voice carrying genuine relief. "How was the flight?" "Long," Thomas said, smiling. "But we're here." Bernard had already checked them in. The hotel was exactly as he had described, intimate and charming, with narrow hallways and rooms that overlooked a cobblestone courtyard. Their room was on the 3rd floor, small but well-appointed, with a double bed, a writing desk and a window that opened onto the street below. Bernard's room was directly across the hall. They agreed to meet for dinner in an hour, giving Elena and Thomas time to unpack and freshen up. As they settled into the room, Elena felt the exhaustion of travel catching up with her. She sat on the edge of the bed, unlacing her shoes, while Thomas hung clothes in the narrow closet. "This is nice," he said. "Better than I expected." Elena nodded. "Your father has good taste." They changed and met Bernard downstairs. He had made a reservation at a bistro 2 blocks away, a neighborhood place he said he had discovered that afternoon while exploring. The walk through the Marais was quiet, the streets lit by warm street lamps, the air crisp with the first cold of late autumn. Elena pulled her coat tighter as they walked, aware of the strangeness of being here. In this city she had only seen in photographs, with her husband and his father. The restaurant was cozy, tables packed close together, menus written in chalk on blackboards. Bernard ordered a bottle of red wine and suggested they share a cheese platter to start. The conversation began tentatively, Bernard asking about their work, Thomas updating him on recent projects. Elena contributed when prompted, but found herself mostly listening, observing the easy rapport between father and son. It had been a long time since she had seen Thomas this relaxed. As the meal progressed, Bernard shifted the conversation toward Paris itself. He spoke about the writers who had lived in the Marais, the history embedded in the architecture, the way certain streets still carried the spirit of old literary salons. His passion for the city was evident, and Elena found herself drawn into his descriptions despite her fatigue. He was a good storyteller, patient and detailed, his voice carrying a quiet authority. When they returned to the hotel, it was past 11. Thomas was visibly tired, the jet lag beginning to settle in. They said goodnight to Bernard and retreated to their room. Thomas collapsed onto the bed almost immediately, falling asleep within minutes. Elena lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a foreign city filtering through the window. She felt the weight of the week ahead, the unspoken expectations, the hope that this trip might offer something more than simply a change of scenery. But beneath that hope was something else, a feeling she could not yet name, a subtle awareness that the arrangement of this trip, the proximity, the intimacy of shared days in an unfamiliar place, carried risks she had not fully considered. She pushed the thought away, telling herself it was only exhaustion, only the disorientation of travel. Still, as she drifted toward sleep, the feeling remained, quiet but persistent, like a question waiting to be asked. The first full day in Paris began with rain. Elena woke to the sound of it tapping against the window, a steady rhythm that filled the small hotel room. Thomas was already awake, sitting at the writing desk with his laptop open, his back to her. She checked her phone. It was barely 7 in the morning. "You're working?" she asked, her voice still thick with sleep. Thomas glanced over his shoulder. "Just checking in. There's an issue with the Queen's project. The contractor found structural problems we didn't account for in the initial survey." Eleanor sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "Can't it wait until we're back? I need to send some revised drawings by tomorrow. It won't take long." She did not argue. This was familiar territory, the way work claimed him even during moments meant for rest. She showered and dressed while he typed, the sound of his keyboard a constant backdrop. When she emerged, he was still focused on the screen, his coffee untouched and cold beside him. Bernard knocked on their door just after 8. He was dressed for the weather, a dark raincoat over his sweater, an umbrella tucked under his arm. "I thought we could start with breakfast at a café I know near Rue de Bretagne," he said. "Then maybe the Picasso Museum, if the rain clears." Thomas looked up from his laptop, distracted. "I need another hour here." "You two should go ahead. I'll catch up." Eleanor saw the disappointment flash across Bernard's face, quickly concealed. "Are you sure?" she asked Thomas. "I'm sure. I'll meet you at the museum. Just text me the address." Bernard waited in the hallway while Elena grabbed her coat. As they descended the narrow staircase, she felt an unexpected awkwardness, the realization that she would be spending the morning alone with her father-in-law. It was not discomfort exactly, but a heightened awareness of the situation, the absence of Thomas as a buffer between them. The café Bernard had chosen was a corner establishment with large windows, fogged by steam from the espresso machine. They sat at a small table near the back, ordering croissants and coffee. The rain continued outside, blurring the street into soft shapes and muted colors. "Thomas works too much," Bernard said quietly, stirring sugar into his cup. Elena wrapped her hands around the warmth of her coffee. "He's always been like that, driven. His mother was the same way. She couldn't sit still, always filling time with tasks." Bernard paused, his gaze distant. "I used to tell her that life happens in the spaces between work, but she never quite believed me." Elena had heard stories about Thomas's mother, Catherine, a public health researcher who had juggled fieldwork and academic writing until the cancer diagnosis forced her to stop. Thomas spoke of her with reverence, a woman whose dedication had shaped his own approach to work. "Do you miss her?" Elena asked, then immediately regretted the directness of the question. Bernard did not seem bothered. "Every day. But missing someone and being trapped by that loss are different things. I spent too long in the second category." He looked at Elena with an openness that surprised her. This trip is partly about changing that. They finished breakfast and walked toward the Picasso Museum, sharing Bernard's umbrella as the rain lightened to a drizzle. The streets of the Marais were quiet at this hour, shop shutters still closed, the city slowly waking. Bernard walked with purpose, but without hurry, occasionally pointing out architectural details or historical markers. He had a way of speaking that invited conversation rather than lecturing, asking Elena about her work, her family, her impressions of the neighborhood. She found herself talking more freely than she had expected, describing the challenges of her non-profit job, the frustrations of inadequate funding and bureaucratic obstacles. Bernard listened with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions that showed he was paying attention. It had been a long time since someone had listened to her this way, without distraction or impatience. The museum was nearly empty when they arrived. They moved through the galleries slowly, Bernard offering occasional insights about Picasso's blue period, the shift toward cubism, the personal tragedies reflected in certain works. Elena appreciated his knowledge, but also the way he did not dominate the experience, allowing silence to settle between observations. Thomas texted around 11 to say he was still working through the revisions. He would try to join them for lunch. Elena felt a flash of irritation but suppressed it, reminding herself that his work crisis was legitimate. Still, the pattern was unmistakable. Even here, in Paris, on a trip meant to break from routine, work took precedence. They left the museum and found a small restaurant near Place des Vosges. Bernard ordered in French, his accent flawless, and the waiter responded with the kind of respect reserved for those who speak the language well. Over lunch they talked about books. Bernard asked what she was reading, and when she mentioned the novel she had started on the plane, he admitted he had taught it years ago in one of his courses. "What did you think of the ending?" he asked. Elena hesitated. She had not finished it yet, but she offered her thoughts on the characters, the slow unraveling of a marriage, the author's refusal to offer easy resolution. Bernard nodded thoughtfully, adding his own interpretation, suggesting that the ambiguity was intentional, a reflection of how relationships resist neat conclusions. The conversation shifted naturally, touching on films, travel, the differences between American and European sensibilities. Elena realized she was enjoying herself, not in the performative way she sometimes felt obligated to enjoy social interactions, but genuinely. Bernard was attentive without being intrusive, intelligent without being condescending. He made her feel seen in a way that had become rare. Thomas finally joined them mid-afternoon as they walked through the arcades of Place des Vosges. He looked tired, his face drawn. "Sorry," he said, kissing Elena on the cheek. "That took longer than I thought." Bernard clapped his son on the shoulder. "You're here now." "That's what matters." They spent the rest of the afternoon together, visiting a bookstore Bernard loved, then stopping for coffee at a café near the Seine. But the dynamic had shifted. Thomas was present physically but mentally elsewhere, checking his phone repeatedly, responding to messages. Bernard tried to engage him in conversation, but the replies were brief, distracted. That evening they returned to the hotel to rest before dinner. In their room, Elena confronted Thomas gently. "This is supposed to be a break. Can the work wait?" Thomas sat on the bed, rubbing his eyes. "I know, I'm sorry. It's just this one project. After tomorrow, I'll be free." But Elena had heard versions of this promise before. There was always one more project, one more deadline, one more crisis that required immediate attention. She did not press further, recognizing the futility of the argument. Dinner that night was at a brasserie Bernard had reserved weeks in advance. The food was excellent, the atmosphere lively, but Thomas remained subdued, his exhaustion evident. He excused himself early, saying he needed sleep. Bernard offered to walk Elena back to the hotel, but she could see the disappointment in his expression, the recognition that the trip was not unfolding as he had hoped. As they walked through the lamplit streets, Bernard spoke quietly. "I worry about him. He's so much like his mother, pouring everything into work until there's nothing left for himself." Elena did not know how to respond. She felt the truth of Bernard's observation, but also a defensiveness on Thomas's behalf. "He's doing his best," she said. "I know he is," Bernard replied. "But sometimes our best isn't enough if we're aiming at the wrong target." They reached the hotel in silence. Bernard said goodnight and disappeared into his room. Elena found Thomas already asleep, his phone still clutched in his hand. She took it gently, plugged it into the charger, and lay beside him in the darkness, aware of the growing space between them that even Paris could not seem to bridge. By the third day, a routine had established itself. Thomas woke early to handle work emergencies that seemed to multiply despite the time difference. Elena and Bernard breakfasted together, then explored the city while Thomas promised to join them later. He rarely did. That morning they visited the Rodin Museum. The gardens were nearly empty, the sculptures standing against a grey November sky. Bernard walked slowly, pausing before each piece, offering observations that were personal rather than academic. He spoke about the way Rodin captured movement in bronze, the tension between strength and vulnerability. Elena found herself standing before The Kiss, the famous sculpture of two lovers locked in an embrace. She studied the piece silently, aware of Bernard beside her. "It's based on Paolo and Francesca," Bernard said quietly, "from Dante's Inferno. They were condemned for adultery, but Rodin chose to immortalize the moment before the sin, when desire was still innocent." Eleanor felt the weight of the statement. "Before consequences," she said. "Yes, before everything became complicated." They moved on, but the conversation lingered. Elena recognized something shifting between them, a comfort that felt both natural and dangerous. Bernard did not flirt, did not cross boundaries overtly, but his attention was complete in a way that Thomas's had not been for months. He listened when she spoke. He remembered details she mentioned in passing. He created space for her thoughts without rushing to fill silence with his own. That afternoon, Thomas cancelled their planned visit to Versailles, citing a video conference he could not miss. Elena felt anger rise sharp and hot. She had been accommodating, understanding, patient, but this felt like a betrayal of the trip's purpose. "Go without me," Thomas said, not looking up from his laptop. "My dad's been there before. He can show you around." "That's not the point," Elena said, her voice tight. "I know. I'm sorry. Tomorrow will be different. I promise." But Elena had stopped believing in tomorrow. She left the room and found Bernard waiting in the lobby. When she told him about the change in plans, he simply nodded. "We could visit the Musée d'Orsay instead," he suggested. "It's closer and we can take our time." They took a taxi across the Seine. The museum was crowded, tour groups clustering around famous paintings. They moved through the Impressionist galleries, standing before Monet's water lilies, Renoir's dancers, Degas' ballet scenes. Bernard spoke about the artist's obsession with light and movement, the way they tried to capture moments that could not be held. "Do you paint?" Elena asked. "I used to. Nothing serious. Catherine was the visual artist in our marriage. She saw things I couldn't." He paused before a Kyla-bought painting of rain-slicked Paris streets. "After she died, I stopped noticing beauty for a while. Everything felt grey. And now—" Bernard turned to look at her, his expression unguarded. "Now I'm remembering how." The intensity of his gaze unsettled her. Elena looked away, pretending to study the painting. But she felt the shift, the unspoken acknowledgement of something developing between them that neither had intended. They had lunch at a café near Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Bernard ordered wine, and Eleanor did not refuse. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, golden and warm. They talked about everything except what was happening. Bernard described his years teaching, the students who had surprised him, the ones who had disappointed him. Elena spoke about her childhood in Texas, her parents' immigrant journey, the pressure to succeed that had shaped her choices. "Do you love your work?" Bernard asked. The question caught her off guard. "I believe in it." "That's not the same thing, is it?" "No," Bernard agreed. "Belief sustains us, but love transforms us." "Do you think Thomas loves his work?" Bernard considered this. "I think he's afraid to stop moving. If he slows down, he might have to face things he's been avoiding." Like what? Like whether he's happy. The statement hung between them. Elena knew Bernard was right, but hearing it spoken aloud made it undeniable. Thomas was not happy, and neither was she. They had built a life together that looked successful from the outside, but felt hollow from within. They walked back to the hotel through the Luxembourg Gardens. The trees were bare, leaves scattered across gravel paths. Families played near the fountain despite the cold. Bernard walked close beside her, their arms occasionally brushing. Each contact felt deliberate, though neither acknowledged it. At the hotel entrance, Bernard hesitated. "Thank you for today. I know this isn't what you expected from this trip." "Neither is it what you expected," Elena replied. "No," Bernard admitted. "But I'm grateful anyway." That evening, Thomas suggested they order room service and skip going out. He looked exhausted, guilt written across his face. Elena agreed, too tired to argue. They ate in silence, the television playing news neither of them watched. "I'm letting you down," Thomas said finally. Elena wanted to contradict him, but she could not. "Yes," she said simply. Thomas set down his fork. "I don't know how to be different. This is who I am. Maybe that's the problem." The words came out sharper than she intended, but she did not take them back. Thomas stared at her, hurt evident in his expression. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. Instead, he stood and went to the bathroom, closing the door behind him. Elena sat alone, staring at the half-eaten food. She heard the shower turn on. She knew Thomas would stay in there until the moment passed, until they could both pretend the conversation had not happened. This was their pattern, conflict avoided rather than resolved, distance widening incrementally. She thought about Bernard, about the way he listened, the way he saw her clearly. She thought about the afternoon in the museum, the warmth of the cafe, the ease of conversation that required no performance. She knew these thoughts were dangerous, that she was rationalizing feelings that should not exist, but knowing and stopping were different things. And as she sat in that hotel room, listening to water run behind a closed door, Eleanor realized she did not want to stop. The recognition frightened her, but it also felt like relief, like finally acknowledging a truth she had been avoiding. Tomorrow, they would visit Montmartre. Bernard had suggested it that morning. Thomas would probably find another reason to stay behind. And Elena would go, knowing what she was choosing, knowing where it might lead, unable to turn away from the pull of something that felt, for the first time in months, like being truly alive. Montmartre rose above Paris like a memory of a different city, its narrow streets winding upward towards Sacré-Cœur. Elena and Bernard climbed the steps slowly, pausing occasionally to catch their breath and look back at the sprawl of rooftops below. Thomas had declined to join them, citing another conference call that could not be rescheduled. Elena had stopped protesting. She had stopped feeling guilty about the relief she felt when Thomas stayed behind. The morning was cold, but clear, sunlight cutting sharp angles across white stone buildings. Bernard wore a scarf she had not seen before, dark blue wool that made his grey eyes more pronounced. They stopped at a café near Place du Tertre, where artists set up easels and tourists posed for portraits. "Catherine and I came here on our honeymoon," Bernard said, stirring his coffee. "She insisted on having her portrait drawn. The artist made her look 20 years older. She laughed about it for the rest of the trip." Elena smiled. "You talk about her easily now. Time helps. And distance. Being here with someone who didn't know her makes it easier somehow. There's no shared grief to navigate. Is that why you invited us? To escape the grief?" Bernard met her eyes. "I invited Thomas because he's my son and I miss him. But I'm grateful you came for different reasons." The statement hung between them, unambiguous. Elena felt her pulse quicken. She should change the subject, redirect the conversation to safer territory. Instead, she said, "What reasons?" Bernard leaned forward slightly. "You know what reasons?" A street musician began playing accordion nearby, the music drifting across the square. Elena looked away, watching tourists photograph the white dome of the basilica above. She felt the moment stretching, demanding a response she was not ready to give. "We should keep walking," she said finally. They climbed higher, moving through streets lined with old cabarets and shuttered theaters. Bernard pointed out the building where Picasso had lived, the cafe where Hemingway used to drink. But the historical commentary felt like performance now, a way to fill space while something else built beneath the surface. They reached Sacré-Cœur just before noon. The basilica's interior was dim and cavernous, voices echoing off marble and mosaic. They sat in a rear pew, not speaking, the weight of sacred space enforcing silence. Elena was not religious, but she felt the gravity of the place, the centuries of prayer and confession absorbed into stone. When they emerged, Bernard suggested lunch at a restaurant he knew near Moulin Rouge. They took the metro, standing close in the crowded car, Bernard's hand steadying her as the train lurched forward. The contact was brief but deliberate, his fingers warm through the fabric of her coat. The restaurant was small and dimly lit, tucked into a side street. The waiter greeted Bernard in French, clearly recognizing him from a previous visit. They were seated at a corner table, a candle flickering between them despite the daylight outside. Bernard ordered wine without asking if she wanted it. Elena found she did not mind the presumption. They ate slowly, the conversation drifting from books to music to the strangeness of desire, discussed abstractly, as if talking about characters in a novel rather than themselves. "Do you think people choose who they love?" Elena asked. "Or does it just happen?" "I think we choose what we do about it," Bernard replied. "The feeling itself is beyond control." That seems like a dangerous philosophy, perhaps. But denying what we feel doesn't make it less real. It just makes us dishonest. Elena drank her wine, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. She knew where this conversation was leading. She knew she should stop it. But the pull was too strong, the loneliness too deep, the attention too intoxicating. "What do you feel?" she asked quietly. Bernard set down his glass. His expression was serious, stripped of the casual warmth he usually carried. "I feel like I'm standing at the edge of something that will hurt everyone involved. And I can't seem to step back. Neither can I." The admission felt like breaking glass, sharp and irreversible. Bernard reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Elena did not pull away. They sat like that for a long moment, the restaurant noise fading into background static. When they left, the sky had clouded over, threatening rain. They walked without destination, moving through streets that blurred together. Bernard took her hand openly now, and Elena let him, feeling the transgression of it, the weight of betrayal and the lightness of release happening simultaneously. They found themselves in a small park, deserted except for an elderly woman feeding pigeons. Bernard turned to face Elena, his hands on her shoulders. "We can stop this now. Go back to the hotel. Pretend today was just a nice walk." Elena looked at him, seeing the conflict in his face, the desire fighting against decency. She thought about Thomas, probably still hunched over his laptop, oblivious or uncaring. She thought about their marriage, the slow erosion, the loneliness disguised as partnership. "I don't want to pretend," she said. Bernard kissed her. It was not tentative or questioning. It was the kiss of someone who had been holding back and could no longer sustain the restraint. Elena responded, her hands moving to his face, pulling him closer. The world contracted to just that moment, that contact, the taste of wine and the cold November air. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Bernard rested his forehead against hers. "We can't go back from this." "I know." They stood there, holding each other, aware that they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The rain began, light at first, then heavier. They did not move, letting it soak through their coats, the cold bringing them back to reality. Finally, Bernard stepped back. "We should get out of the rain." They walked back to the metro in silence, no longer touching, the intimacy of the kiss replaced by the weight of what they had done. On the train, they stood apart, avoiding eye contact, each lost in their own reckoning. At the hotel, they separated in the lobby without a word. Elena climbed the stairs slowly, her clothes damp, her mind racing. She opened the door to find Thomas exactly where she had left him that morning, laptop open, absorbed in work. He looked up. "How was Montmartre?" Elena hung her wet coat on the hook. "It was beautiful." Thomas nodded and returned to his screen. He did not ask why she was soaked. He did not notice the shift in her expression or the tremor in her hands. He noticed nothing, and in that moment, Elena felt the last thread of guilt snap cleanly away. The affair began in earnest the following evening. Thomas had arranged another late call with his firm, apologizing mechanically, as he always did. Elena told him she was meeting Bernard for dinner, a statement that carried no lie but concealed everything that mattered. Thomas barely looked up from his screen. Bernard had chosen a hotel different from their own, across the river in the Latin Quarter. The room was anonymous, impersonal, the kind of space that existed for exactly this purpose. When Elena arrived, Bernard was standing by the window looking out at the street below. He turned when she entered, and neither spoke. Words would have required justification, explanation, the construction of excuses. Neither believed. What followed was not gentle or romantic. It carried the urgency of people who knew they were destroying something, but could not stop themselves. Afterward, they lay in the narrow bed, not touching, the reality of what they had done settling like ash. "This is unforgivable," Bernard said quietly. Elena stared at the ceiling. "Yes, I keep thinking about Thomas, about how this would break him. Then why are we here?" Bernard turned to face her. "Because I'm selfish. Because being near you feels like breathing after years of suffocation. Because I've stopped caring about consequences." Elena felt tears slide down her temples. "I don't recognize myself anymore." "Neither do I." They dressed in silence. Bernard walked her back toward her hotel, stopping a block away to avoid being seen together. Before they separated, he touched her face gently. "Tomorrow." Elena nodded, hating herself, needing him, unable to choose differently. The pattern repeated over the next 2 days. Thomas worked. Elena and Bernard explored Paris by day and met in the Latin Quarter Hotel by evening. They created elaborate cover stories, invented museum visits and restaurant reservations, constructing a false itinerary while living a parallel reality. But cracks began showing. Thomas, despite his distraction, noticed small changes. Elena returned to their room later than expected. Her mood shifted, oscillating between guilt and defiance. One evening, he found a receipt in her coat pocket for a cafe they had not discussed visiting. "Where's this place?" Thomas asked, holding up the paper. Elena's heart seized. "Near the Pantheon. Bernard and I had coffee there." "When?" "Yesterday afternoon." "Why?" Thomas studied her face. "You said you went to the Musée Rodin yesterday." Elena had forgotten which lie she had told. "We did both. Coffee first, then the museum." Thomas set down the receipt slowly. Something in his expression had changed, suspicion crystallizing into focus. "Are you having an affair?" The directness of the question shocked her. Elena felt panic rise, but she forced her voice steady. "What? No, Thomas, that's insane." "Is it? You're spending all day with my father. You come back different. You barely look at me anymore, because you're never here. You've spent this entire trip working. Don't turn this around." "Something's wrong. I can feel it." Elena's mind raced, searching for the right response, the exact tone that would diffuse his suspicion. "I'm angry at you. That's what you're feeling. I'm angry that you brought work to Paris, that you've wasted this trip, that your father planned something special and you've barely participated." The accusation was true enough to land. Thomas's expression shifted from suspicion to guilt. "I know, you're right. I've screwed this up. Yes, you have." Thomas sat on the bed, his shoulders sagging. "Tomorrow, no work. I promise. The 3 of us will spend the whole day together." Elena felt dread flood through her. "Okay." She texted Bernard later from the bathroom, warning him about Thomas's suspicions, telling him they needed to be more careful. Bernard's response was immediate. "We should stop. This is getting dangerous." But neither of them meant it. The next morning, Thomas kept his promise, joining them for breakfast, insisting on planning the day together. They visited Notre Dame, still under reconstruction from the fire, then walked along the Seine. Thomas was attentive, asking questions, making jokes, trying to recapture something that had already been lost. Elena felt trapped between two realities. Thomas held her hand as they walked. Bernard stayed slightly apart, his expression carefully neutral. But she felt the tension in Bernard's silence, the strain of pretending, the electricity of proximity without contact. That afternoon, at a cafe near the river, Thomas excused himself to use the restroom. The moment he was out of sight, Bernard leaned forward. "I can't do this," he said quietly. "Watching him try to fix things, knowing what we've done, then what do we do? I don't know, but this ends badly. You understand that?" Elena did understand. She had known from the moment in Montmartre. But understanding and stopping were different things. "One more night," she said. "Then we figure out what happens next." Bernard looked at her with something close to desperation. "This will destroy him." "I know." When Thomas returned, he suggested they have dinner at the hotel restaurant, all three of them together. Elena agreed, feeling the walls closing in. That evening was excruciating. Thomas talked about extending the trip, about coming back to Paris next year, about how grateful he was for his father's generosity. Bernard smiled and nodded, playing his role perfectly, while Elena felt herself fracturing. After dinner, Thomas went upstairs first, exhausted from the day's walking. Elena lingered in the lobby, and Bernard appeared moments later from the bar. "My room." "Midnight," he whispered. "Last time." Elena knew she should refuse. She knew the risk was too high. Thomas's suspicions already aroused, the danger of discovery multiplying. But she nodded anyway, addiction overriding reason. She waited until Thomas was deeply asleep, then slipped out, crossing the narrow hallway to Bernard's room. He opened the door immediately, pulling her inside. This time was different, tinged with desperation and goodbye, both of them knowing they were stealing moments that would cost more than they could afford. Afterward, as Elena dressed to return to her room, Bernard spoke from the bed. "I love you. I need you to know that." This wasn't just physical. Elena stopped, her hand on the door. "Don't say that. It's true. It doesn't matter." "It can't matter." She opened the door carefully, checking the hallway. It was empty. She stepped out, closing Bernard's door quietly behind her. She had taken 3 steps toward her own room when she heard it, the click of a door opening. She turned. Thomas stood in their doorway, fully dressed, his face illuminated by the hallway light. He was not surprised. He was not confused. His expression carried only the weight of confirmed suspicion and devastating comprehension. "How long?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. Elena could not speak. Behind her she heard Bernard's door open. Thomas's gaze shifted, seeing his father emerge, understanding everything in that single moment. The 3 of them stood in the narrow hallway, the geometry of betrayal made visible. No one moved, no one spoke. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, and then Thomas turned, walked back into his room, and closed the door with a quiet finality more terrible than rage. Elena stood frozen in the hallway, her hand still raised toward the door Thomas had closed. Bernard emerged fully from his room, his face drained of color. Neither moved, trapped in the moment's terrible clarity. "We need to talk to him," Bernard said finally. "What could we possibly say?" Bernard had no answer. They stood there until the absurdity of their position forced movement. Elena tried the door to her room. It was locked from inside. She knocked softly, then harder. No response came. "Thomas, please, let me in." Silence. Bernard knocked on his side. "Son, open the door. We need to discuss this." The word discuss hung in the air, grotesquely inadequate. What had happened could not be discussed, negotiated, or rationalized. It could only be endured. After 10 minutes of futile attempts, they retreated to Bernard's room. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, where hours earlier she had betrayed her husband with his father. The weight of that reality pressed down until breathing became difficult. "He'll calm down," Bernard said, pacing. "In the morning we'll explain." "Explain what? That we fell in love? That his marriage was already broken? What explanation makes this acceptable?" Bernard stopped pacing. "None. There is no explanation. They waited through the night, taking turns checking the hallway, knocking periodically on Thomas's door. No response ever came. Elena's mind circled through scenarios, each worse than the last. She imagined Thomas packing, leaving for the airport, disappearing from her life. She imagined him sitting in the dark, processing the betrayal, the images of his wife and father searing into memory. Dawn came grey and cold. At 7, Elena tried the door again. This time it opened. The room was empty. Thomas's suitcase was gone, his laptop, his clothes. Only Elena's belongings remained undisturbed, as if she were merely a guest who had overstayed. Bernard checked with the front desk. Thomas had checked out at 5 in the morning, paying for both rooms through the original departure date. He had left no message, no forwarding information. The clerk said he had seemed calm, almost eerily so, asking only for a taxi to Charles de Gaulle. Elena felt panic overtake numbness. She tried calling Thomas's phone. It went straight to voicemail. She sent texts that showed as delivered but unread. Bernard attempted the same with identical results. Thomas had severed contact completely. "We need to go home," Elena said. "We need to find him." They booked flights for that afternoon, abandoning the remaining days of the trip. The taxi ride to the airport passed in silence. At the terminal, they separated, Bernard heading to a different gate, unable to maintain the pretense of traveling together. Before he left, he touched Elena's arm. "This is my fault. I'm his father. I should have stopped this. We both should have. What happens now?" Elena had been asking herself the same question. "I don't know. But whatever it is, we face it separately." Bernard nodded, understanding the implicit message. Whatever they had shared in Paris ended with Thomas's discovery. There would be no future for them, no relationship built on the ruins of betrayal. The affair had been born of loneliness and proximity, sustained by secrecy, and it could not survive exposure. Elena's flight landed at JFK 13 hours later. She took a taxi to Brooklyn, her hands shaking as she climbed the steps to their apartment. The door was unlocked. Inside, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, exactly where she had last seen him before they left for Paris. His laptop was closed. The apartment was dark despite the afternoon light available outside. "Thomas," she began. He held up a hand, stopping her. When he spoke, his voice was flat, drained of emotion. "I don't want explanations. I don't want apologies. I just need to understand one thing. Did you love him?" Elena felt tears start, but forced herself to answer truthfully. "I don't know. Maybe. In that moment I did." Thomas nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "My father called me 3 times from the airport." I didn't answer. "Did he tell you to say that? That it was love?" "No, he told me this was his fault. It's both your faults. But somehow it's also mine, isn't it? I neglected you. I chose work over our marriage. I created the conditions." He looked at her directly for the first time. "That's what you'll tell people, isn't it? That I drove you to it. I won't tell anyone anything. Everyone will know. My father, my wife. In Paris," he laughed, a sound without humor. "It's almost literary. He would appreciate that. The symmetry. Thomas, I'm sorry. I know you are. But sorry doesn't repair this. Sorry doesn't make me unsee what I saw. Sorry doesn't erase the fact that every time I looked at him, trusted him, asked him for advice, he was sleeping with my wife." Elena had no response. The truth of his words was absolute. Thomas stood, picking up a folder from the table. "I've drafted divorce papers. Irreconcilable differences. I'm not contesting anything. You can have the apartment, the furniture, whatever. I just want this finished quickly. Where will you go?" "That's not your concern anymore." He walked past her toward the bedroom. Elena heard drawers opening, clothes being gathered. When he emerged 20 minutes later with a packed bag, he paused at the door. "I loved you," he said quietly. "I loved you more than I knew how to show. And I loved my father in a way that assumed his love for me was unconditional. I was wrong about both of you." He left, the door closing with mechanical precision. Elena stood alone in the apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a life that no longer existed. She tried to feel something, regret, relief, grief, but found only emptiness. Over the following weeks, the divorce proceeded with cold efficiency. Thomas communicated only through his attorney. He had taken a position with a firm in Seattle, relocating immediately. Bernard tried to reach his son repeatedly, writing letters, leaving voicemails. All went unanswered. 1 month after Paris, Elena received a call from a Vermont area code. A colleague of Bernard's. Her voice was formal, careful. Bernard had died 3 days earlier. A heart attack, sudden and massive. He had been found in his home by a neighbor who noticed his mail accumulating. Elena attended the funeral alone. The service was small, attended mostly by former colleagues and a few distant relatives. Thomas did not come. Eleanor stood in the back of the chapel, watching Bernard's casket, knowing that the guilt had likely killed him as surely as any blocked artery. Afterward, a lawyer approached her. Bernard had left a letter, sealed, marked with her name. She opened it in her car, hands trembling. The letter was brief. Bernard wrote that he could not live with what he had done to his son, that the affair, however genuine the feelings, had been the greatest mistake of his life, that he had destroyed the only family he had left. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply stated facts, clinical and devastating. The final line read, "Some betrayals cannot be survived. I loved you both, and that is precisely what makes this unforgivable." Elena folded the letter and drove back to Brooklyn. The apartment felt like a museum of failure. She moved out 2 weeks later, relocating to a smaller place across the river. She changed jobs, changed routines, changed everything she could control, but she could not change what had happened, could not undo the week in Paris, could not restore the family she had helped destroy. Thomas's life continued somewhere on the West Coast, but to Elena he existed only as absence, a ghost of what they had been. Years later, she would still think about that hallway, the moment Thomas opened the door. The geometry of 3 people who had loved each other in incompatible ways. She would think about Bernard's letter, the weight of guilt made literal. She would think about choices made and damage done. The affair had ended not in dramatic confrontation, but in quiet devastation. Relationships disintegrating into silence. A father dead from shame, a son lost to justified anger, a marriage reduced to legal paperwork. The tragedy was not a single event, but an accumulation. Betrayal compounding into irreparable harm. Paris remained in her memory as both beautiful and poisoned. A city where she had felt briefly alive while destroying everything that mattered. Some mistakes, she learned, cannot be repaired. Some betrayals leave wounds that never fully close. And some loves, no matter how real they feel in the moment, cost more than anyone should have to pay.